From its creation in 1948, the modern state of Israel was besieged on all sides by hostile Arab neighbors, whose ambition was nothing less than its total and utter annihilation.
My dear brothers and sisters, today we will continue our study on the great day of Jacob's trouble. On the first class we saw what was Jacob's trouble, and in the second class we saw from whom Jacob's trouble came, and today we will see some more about how the Jacob's trouble is going to be. Brothers and sisters, we know how Jacob's trouble started when Jacob, after being away from the promised land for nearly 20 years, returns back to the land of promise. And that is when Esau comes to face him. And Jacob had to divide his family, and then he had to face it all alone. Brothers and sisters, by this time, I'm sure you all have understood that we are seeing Jacob as a shadow of what will happen to the nation of Israel. And everything that happened in Jacob's life, we are seeing happening in the nation of Israel. Israel was scattered from their homeland when they rejected Jesus Christ as the Messiah. God in his wrath dispersed them in all the Gentile nations. And after 20 decades, God brought them back to the promised land. And that is when they had to face this Esau-like armies of the Arab nations. And that is when Jacob's trouble begins. Brothers and sisters, in Jeremiah chapter 30, which we are following, we'll read from verse 6 again and see how this Jacob's trouble is going to start and how it's going to end. Jeremiah chapter 30, verse 6.
Ask ye now, and see whether a man doth travail with child? Wherefore do I see every man with his hands on his lions, as the women in travail, and all faces are turned into paleness?
You see, God is saying, can men get birth pangs? Can men get travel pains? It's not possible. But here I see everyone suffering this pain, he says. So we know how the pregnant woman gets pain. It's not all just one pain. She doesn't just get one pain and is not delivered in that way. But it's a series of pains. The pain starts and then there is small relaxation and again the pain comes back. The pain keeps coming back and back again until finally in a big pain the woman is delivered. So also Jacob's experience. As we see the nation of Israel, the moment they came back and were set up, established as a nation, the birth pang started. The pain started. And we can see that it has been a series of pains. Brothers and sisters, in 1948, the people of Israel declared independence. And there was great rejoicing. And a nation was born after 2,000 years. But at the same time, the Arabs plotted to come against Israel. And they declared war, and 5 nations fell upon Israel. So that was the first pain that the nation of Israel experienced after coming back. And we know the nations were Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and even Iraq joined in this war, and the army started pouring into Israel. And they came with so much hatred and so much anger. They wanted to destroy Israel, push Israel into the sea. But God saved Israel in that crisis. So, brothers and sisters, Israel was not only able to defend itself against these 5 armies coming from all directions, but it even expanded its territory after this war. So, brothers and sisters, we know that from this, that God was with the nation of Israel. And the second pain came when Egypt began to put restrictions on Israeli movements around the Suez Canal. Egypt had taken control over the Suez Canal, and they were blocking ships coming from Israel, and this was putting Israel into great trouble because its trade and commerce was greatly affected. And in spite of repeated requests, Egypt would not allow Israeli ships to pass through. And then Israel had to attack Egypt. And then in 1956, Israel sent its army and took control of Suez Canal itself. And this was a big victory, and so much so that the Egyptians were forced to allow Israeli ships to pass through. And after this, of course, comes the great 6-day war, of which Israel celebrated the 52nd anniversary just last week, from June 5th to June 10th. In 1967, this war, so famously called a 6-day war, took place. Brothers and sisters, just before that, Egypt was preparing for war. There was anger and hatred, and they declared that they were going to destroy Israel this time. And Syria also joined in. And on May 19th, 1967, Egypt deployed 100,000 soldiers on Sinai Peninsula, on border of the Israeli southern border. And then Syria also moved its troops, and they had prepared so many airplanes and hundreds of tanks. And this time they were very well equipped, and they wanted to destroy Israel. But then Israel, knowing of this, they had a preemptive strike. They decided to attack them even before they started their war. And on 5th of June, as we all know, that they sent their aeroplanes and destroyed all the Egyptian Air Force, even when it was still on the ground. They destroyed their airports, and even the Syrian airplanes and their airports were destroyed. And immediately Israel gained control of the airspace, and after that there was no stopping them. In just 6 days, they were able to inflict so much damage on the Egyptian armies and the Syrian army that they had to go back. And in this battle, Israel was able to conquer so much land. In fact, they were able to take control of the entire Sinai Peninsula. They were able to take control of Gaza Strip and West Bank, including the Old Jerusalem, which was up until that time in the hands of Jordan. The people of Israel were not even allowed to go into the holy site. But now, after 1967 Six-Day War, the Old Jerusalem was in their power, and then they took hold of the Golan Heights in the north also. And from Golan Heights in Syria, they were being bombarded often, because that was a very important location from that height to hit Israel. But now even that was in the hands of Israel. So this was a very big victory for Israel, and these Egyptian armies, and even including Iraq also, who sent their supporters, were defeated in this war. And after this, in August 1967, the Arab leaders all met in Khartoum, the capital of Sudan, and they vowed to fight against Israel. And they signed a pact called Three No's Pact that is famously called as Three No's, because they said no recognition of Israel, no peace with Israel, and no negotiations with Israel. We are not going to make any peace, and we are going to continue this war. And that's what they said. Brothers and sisters, and then came this Yom Kippur War. Yom Kippur is a very holy day for Israel, and as they were celebrating that, Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel. It was so taken off guard that it took 3 days for Israel to muster up a defense. And then, as they were in the process of turning things to their favor, that's when Arab nations also tried to put pressure on Western countries by making the price of oil 4 times the usual price in order to prevent America, Japan, and other European countries from supporting Israel. Nevertheless, Israel fought on its own, and when it was about to gain over Egypt and Syria, Russia had to interfere, and Russia threatened to interfere, and then it looked as if America also had to fight Russia, and it would become a very big global crisis, because Russia and America both are nuclear powers, and this would have become very big. That time America realized the danger, and it mediated a ceasefire, and then that war was stopped. So, brothers and sisters, this is what happened in 1973. And next year, seeing that Egypt could not fight Israel, Egypt realized this, and they made peace with Israel, and Israel returned the Sinai Peninsula for this peace agreement. And afterwards, in 1994, Jordan also signed a peace treaty because it was not able to bear the cost of resisting Israel. The cost was almost up to $18 billion. So they also made peace with Israel. And that is what happened in 1994. And meanwhile, the Palestinians, they formed an organization called the Palestinian Liberation Organization under the leadership of Arafat, and they continually started to attack Israel through raising rebels in Gaza and West Bank, and also in various terrorist attacks. And also in the meantime, they began to muster support, sympathy in all over the world, and projecting Israel as the aggressor and that they were the victims. And this happened, and in the meanwhile, from 2006 to 2010, in that period, Iran also started fighting against Israel by supporting the Hamas and Hezbollah terrorist organizations fighting Israel in Gaza and from Lebanon. Hezbollah was stationed in Lebanon, and they used to get huge arms supplies from Iran, shiploads of supplies, and they used to fire rockets and attack Israel from Lebanon, and so much so that Israel had to fight against Lebanon and destroy the Hezbollah stronghold in that border. But Hamas continued, and we know till today Hamas, receiving the support from Iran, has now stationed in Gaza itself, and they are attacking Israel. As we saw in the past 2 weeks back, Israel was attacked with nearly 4,000 rockets, which Israel was able to destroy in the air by their anti-missile system. And then, in spite of the warning, they continued, and Israel was forced to enter into Gaza, send their planes, and bomb nearly 7,000 buildings. And unlike the Palestinians who fire randomly at the Israeli cities, Israel usually gives warning to the places where they attack so that the people will flee from there and the casualty is reduced. But in spite of that, nearly 274 Palestinians were killed, and about 12 Israelis were killed. But this number of casualties on the side of Israel is less because they were able to defend themselves from all these rockets which was fired at them. If that was not there, then the casualty would be way too far. So, brothers and sisters, and this happened, and we know that for the time being the ceasefire was worked out, and now it has stopped for some time. So all these are the pains that comes upon the pregnant women, or in this case the people of Israel. It continuously comes one after other. So far, God has been saving Israel from all this. And yet, one final pain is about to come upon Israel. That is going to be the final pain in which the people of Israel will be delivered. Just like the woman gets sequence of pains. But then the final pain is most difficult. But from that pain, she is delivered when the baby is born. So, brothers and sisters, that is what we are expecting. And today we will see how that is going to come about. In the Bible, this is called the final war, in which not only all the Arab nations will come up against the nation of Israel, but the whole world will come against Israel. And that is how the great day of Jacob's trouble is going to come upon Israel. The day is going to be such that it says, there shall be no other day like it. That's what we read in Jeremiah chapter 30, verse 7.
Alas, for that day is great, so that none is like it. It is even the time of Jacob's trouble, but he shall be saved out of it.
You see, that day will be so great that there will be no other day like it. Such a great day of trouble for Israel. And then God is going to save Israel from it. So, brothers and sisters, this great day is in other ways called Armageddon in the book of Revelation. And in various other prophetic books, we see God clearly prophesying about this very end scenario. And first we will see in the book of Revelation what it is called in chapter 16, verse 16.
And he gathered them together into a place called in the Hebrew tongue Armageddon.
See, he gathered them into a place which in the Hebrew tongue is called Armageddon. Har-Megaddon it is called. He gathered them, and we see one verse above, the devils which came like frogs, the spirit of frogs, we see one verse above. The devil mustered all the people to a place called Armageddon. In Hebrew, Har means mountain. Megaddon is the name of the place where this mount is situated. So that is in the northern Israel, and that is where all these nations are gathered. And that's how we all Christians know it. Armageddon means the final war, the end of our wars, and the war that will bring about the end of this whole world. That is what we see is going to happen, and that's going to happen in Israel. In Zechariah chapter 14, verses 1 and 2, God says He will also cause all the people to come up against the nation of Israel. That we see in chapter 14, verses 1 and 2.
Behold, the day of the Lord cometh, and thy spoil shall be divided in the midst of thee.
You see, it is called the day of the Lord. Jacob's day is nothing but the day of the Lord, when the Lord will gather all the spoils, he says, and verse 2.
For I will gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle.
See, he will gather all nations against Jerusalem for battle. God is saying he will gather all nations. That's what we have been studying right from the first class, how all nations coming against the nation of Israel. Starting with the Arab nations that are surrounding them, and then the Muslim nations joining with them, and then all those who support these Arabs and the Palestinians are going to come against Israel together at one point in future, and that is called the day of the Lord also. Brothers and sisters, this is again emphasized in Zephaniah, where the prophet says why God is going to gather all these people. That is very clearly we see in Zephaniah chapter 3, verse 8.
Therefore, wait ye upon me, said the Lord, until the day that I rise up to the prey.
You see, he's saying, wait till I rise up to the prayer. Means all these time, God was keeping quiet. You see, he was not doing anything against all these nations, except, of course, saving Israel. Yet, they continued to come upon him again and again, and God was still waiting. But until the time he will rise up to pray. And that is what he says.
Therefore, wait ye upon me, said the Lord, until the day that I rise up to the prayer. For my determination is to gather the nations, that I may assemble the kingdoms, to pour upon them mine indignation, even all my fierce anger, for all the earth shall be devoured with the fire of my jealousy.
You see, God says, all the world will be destroyed with the fire of my jealousy. And his determination is to gather them all to that place, so that he may pour upon them his indignation, his anger, his wrath. Now, why is God so angry? Why is God mustering all the people so that he may pour out his wrath upon them? Because so much injustice is taking place there in respect to the nation God has chosen. Now, God Almighty had promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that he will grant that land to his people. And in keeping up with that promise, God brought them back after 2,000 years, and he is establishing them in that proper place. But all these nations are fighting against it. Right from day one, they are trying to destroy this nation. They are trying to deprive them of that peaceful existence there. And till today, all these 21 Arab nations have refused to even recognize that Israel is a state. And they are mustering all the power to fight against Israel. So naturally, God is so angry. Because God has given so much land to all these other people. The Arab land territory is 400 times greater than that which God has given to the people of Israel. Israel is such a small country compared to the Arab countries. Yet all these Arabs, they don't want to give even that place to Israel. They are fighting and fighting again and again to take away that land from Israel. And in that small place, they want West Bank also and then Gaza also. So much so that they are taking away parts of that small land also. Their land is so much greater. All these, the so-called Palestinians who are actually Muslim Arabs who settled in later time, they can be easily housed in all these places, which they have so much land there. But they refuse to take in these Arabs, their own brethren, these Palestinians. But they want them there and to fight Israel and to cause Israel trouble. And they're using the people in Palestine, the people in Gaza and West Bank, to trouble Israel and to give a bad opinion to the whole world by being there. So that is so very, very hard to take it. Brothers and sisters, if you and I have a small place, in our own place, and if someone tries to encroach that, how angry we will become. How disappointing it is and how sad it is, isn't it? Like in our place in Bangalore, just in front of our church, there is a yard, parking lot. But a few years ago, some people posted a banner there. It's a banner of a film actor. Without our permission, they put it there, and during his birthday and from time to time they will be making celebrations and all. We feel so bad. We don't want that there. It is obstructing our building, our parking place, and it does not look nice at all. We don't want that film actor's poster there. But we are not able to do anything because the political support they have and these people are very powerful, and we are not able to do anything because of that. And if we feel so bad about that, just imagine how God will feel when in the place which he has called holy as his city, and we see Jerusalem mentioned so many times by God, and Mount Zion is a symbol of God's glory In that very place, these Arabs have built their mosque, this dome of rock. How hard it is for God to take all this. Yet God kept quiet all these years. These Muslims who deny that Jesus is the Son of God, who deny that He died on the cross for us, such people have built their mosque in the very place the temple once stood. How wrong it is. So God tolerated and waited all this, but finally God is saying, the time will come, the day will come, when I have determined to bring all nations there, and I will pour out my indignation, my wrath upon them for all that they have done to His people, Israel. So, brothers and sisters, that's what very clearly we see in Zephaniah 3:8. We'll read once again.
Therefore, wait ye upon me, said the Lord, until the day that I rise up to the prey. For my determination is to gather the nations, that I may assemble the kingdoms, to pour upon them mine indignation, even all my fierce anger, for all the earth shall be devoured with the fire of my jealousy.
So, in that day, all the earth itself will be devoured, not just the Arab nations. That is how strongly God has said. See how repeatedly He says His wrath and indignation and His anger, His fierce anger, He will pour out upon them. Such strong words God is using, and that is what we can expect in future. And this is again repeated in the same chapter in verse 16. We can read, when God does that, God is going to spare Jerusalem. When His anger is poured upon all the people, He is going to spare Jerusalem, He says.
In that day it shall be said to Jerusalem, Fear thou not, and to Zion, let not thine hands be slack.
See, so God is going to save them from this great time of trouble which will come upon all the nations.
In that day it shall be said to Jerusalem, Fear thou not, and to Zion, let not thine hands be slack.
You see, God is saying, don't fear. So God is going to protect Israel, but His anger is going to come upon all the nations. The same sentiment is expressed in the prophecy of Joel. Joel prophets also prophesies the same thing, but he doesn't say Jerusalem, but it's actually a valley outside Jerusalem. That is called the valley of Jehoshaphat. So God, He says He's going to bring all the nations there so that He may bring judgment upon them. That we see in Joel chapter 3, verse 2.
I will also gather all nations and bring them down into the valley of Jehoshaphat,
You see, He's
and
again,
will plead with them there for my people and for my heritage Israel.
you see, God is saying, I'll bring all nations to the valley of Jehoshaphat. See, again and again He's saying, He will bring all nations, He will gather them to the valley of Jehoshaphat. Read again.
I will also gather all nations and bring them down into the valley of Jehoshaphat, and will plead with them there for my people and for my heritage Israel.
You see, there I will plead for my people, my heritage Israel is saying. Just as I said then, if anybody takes something which belongs to us, our property, our inheritance, how we feel. Now God is saying about the people of Israel as His people, as His heritage,
whom they have scattered among the nations and parted my land.
you see, whom they have scattered among the nations and parted my land, God is saying. They did not let the Jews stay there for 2,000 years. And now when they are back, now they are taking away parts of that land. They are dividing that land among themselves. So God will not tolerate this, and what He does, He says in verse 12.
Let the heathen be wakened, and come up to the valley of Jehoshaphat, for there will I sit to judge all the heathen round about.
You see, He's saying, let all the heathen come to the valley of Jehoshaphat. There I will sit in judgment upon them. So He's going to gather everyone and he's going to judge them. That is what God has said in Joel. Now, the question is, when this is going to take place? How will this happen? We can only make some intelligent guess as to how this will happen, but anything could happen that will trigger all nations to come up against Israel. Now, one possible reason could be that Israel will be provoked again, as it happened last month when Gaza started firing indiscriminately against Israel. And Israel had to send their planes and bomb them. And then, of course, they backed down and they stopped firing and ceasefire was brought into effect. But what if they do not back out? And what if Israel should continue their assault and take over all the Gaza and West Bank again, which the Prime Minister said he will do if did not stop the rocket fire. But luckily this time they stopped, and the bombing also from Israel side stopped. But he threatened to take over the place entirely if they did not stop. So what if in a future incident, if they started firing even more powerful bombs and rockets and Israel decides to take over the complete West Bank and Gaza under their control? Now that will be seen as a very big aggression against the people of Palestine. Now already Israel is always posed as the aggressor. Now this is so unjust and so unfair, brothers and sisters, because the people from Gaza are the ones who started this rocket fire. And after repeated warning, when they didn't stop this firing hundreds and thousands of rockets, Israel had to bomb them. Now, everywhere, Israel is shown to be the aggressor. And people have held protests in various parts of the world, like in Pakistan and also in America, supporting the cause of Palestinians. Now, how unfair it is. Just imagine there is one mad man on the street and is throwing bricks at everyone. Now, what will any sensible person do? To protect himself, to protect his family and protect his friends, he has to go and stop that man. And that's what Israel is trying to do. And what if that madman is throwing grenades at everyone? And will it be wrong to stop him? That is what the people from Gaza are doing. They are sending rockets at random, thousands and thousands of rockets against Israel, and Israel is expected to just sit and suffer like that. And when they retaliated, now they are seen to be as the aggressor. This is how unfair the people of the world are when it comes to the nation of Israel. Israel, just because they are strong enough to defend themselves and they are able to so far win all the battles that came upon them, they are seen as the aggressor. And just because these people in Gaza and West Bank, they are suffering more than the people of Israel, and as I told you, they are dying because Hamas is using them as the shield, and they are sending rockets from these residential areas, and they are forcing Israel to attack them because they are placing these rockets and tunnels in the places where they are likely to be hit by Israel. And as this is happening, brothers and sisters, the people of the world are not able to see who is the real aggressor here and who are these people of Israel. How pathetic it is that all the nations are already against Israel, and if in case Israel should completely take back the West Bank and Gaza, which they gave to the Arabs, then it will become a very big reason for the people of the world to come out against Israel. Because so far, even the Americans, who are the only supporters of Israel, even they will not support such an act. They want Israel to not enter into these lands and not to make new settlements in these disputed areas, but they want Israel to give up all those lands. But brothers and sisters, Israel, if they are forced to take back these places, then it could be the reason the world can come against Israel. Now there is another possibility, that is Israel attacking Iran. Now why will Israel attack Iran? Because for many years Iran is trying to secretly build a nuclear bomb. So far, only Israel has that nuclear capability. Though they have not declared it, yet it is understood that they have about 80 to 100 nuclear bombs in their power. But Israel is a responsible state. It is the only democratic state in that entire Middle East, and they never attack anyone. Unless they are being attacked, they are forced to defend themselves. And therefore, it is not a danger to anybody. But once Iran or any other Arab country builds a nuclear bomb, then the entire region will become very, very dangerous. Because already they are all at war, and if the others should get nuclear bombs also, then the situation will be totally out of control. And it will be very, very dangerous for Israel. Because Israel is such a small country. And if atomic bombs are used on it, it will not be able to defend itself or protect itself. And Iran, it has vowed to destroy Israel so openly, so many times. Because their supreme leader, Ayatollah Khomeini, and many others with him, the prime ministers and all in the past, have openly declared death to Israel, death to Americans. They hate Israel, and they said they want to destroy Israel. And if such a country is building a nuclear bomb, then definitely the people of Israel has to do something. Because if they are successful in doing that, and it is only a matter of time before somehow through this terrorist organization like Hezbollah or Hamas, they can get it secretly into Israel and destroy Israel. So Israel is forced to do something. And for many years, experts are predicted that Israel is going to attack the nuclear facilities in Iran. So far, Israel has tried to use the international body to pressurize Iran from deferring their path to build this bomb. But Iranians, they are saying that their nuclear facility and all that research that is going on in their country is for peaceful purposes, to produce power plants and to produce electricity and so on. But secretly, everybody knows they are building the bomb. And so far, in spite of all the arms embargo that the international community has put on Iran, yet Iran is every day progressing in building the bomb. So far, Israel has been quiet, but they know that the time is running out, and the longer they wait, the greater the risk is going to be. And they need to strike first. And Israel, as in 1967, as we saw, they were able to survive only because they struck first in their preemptive strike. Because once the Egyptians and Syrians had already fallen, it will be very difficult for Israel to defend itself. And so also, if Iran produces the bomb and it bombs Israel, Israel will be no more there to do anything. So it has to stop Iran even before it produces the bomb. Just like we see in David and Goliath's story. You know, when Goliath with all his arms started approaching David, it was David who did the first strike. He took the stone and he hit Goliath first. Why? Because if he waited and if Goliath hit him first, he will not be there at all. So his secret was to hit first. And so also here Israel has to do something to stop Iran from making this bomb. And so looking at the possibilities, how they might do this. Now, first of all, we should know that Iran is far away from Israel. It's about 1,000 kilometers up to the border, and about another 1,000 to the places where they have these nuclear facilities. So it will be roughly 2,000 kilometers. And aeroplanes that the people of Israel have, not all can go so far. And with all these heavy payload bombs have, they may need to refuel mid-air, which they have the capacity to do so. But even then they have to pass through these other countries, Arab countries like Iraq, which may not permit Israel to fly over them. And in case they still manage to do that, they will not be able to inflict very heavy damage on Iran. There will be a setback, but they will be still able to continue and build their bomb. So in that case, the only possible way in which Israel can completely stop Iran from what they are doing is by bombing them with nuclear bombs. And if they do such a thing, then this will be seen as a very big aggressive act. Though Israel is only doing this to save itself, but the world will not see any logic in that. They will see Israel as the first country to hit with these bombs, and maybe that will cause all the nations to come up against Israel. Even America will become against Israel, because they don't want Israel to attack Iran, because that will destroy their relationship with these Arab people. But they don't really actually worry so much, because they are far off. Israel is the country who are to suffer, and Israel has to take its own decisions, whether it pleases America or not. And this could be one reason which may cause the world to come up against Israel. We do not know. And brothers and sisters, anything can happen to trigger that. And the Bible says that such a thing will happen. That day will definitely happen when all the nations will come up against Israel. And though Israel has been able to defend itself and even win over in all these previous wars with the Arab neighbors, we know that if the whole world comes up against them, they will not be able to do anything. Because countries like Russia and China are very powerful countries, nuclear countries, and Israel will never be able to defend itself against them. And we know, brothers and sisters, that God will allow all these things to happen. God will make all the nations to come up against Israel. God will do that. Why? Because not only to pour out his wrath upon them, but also he wants Israel to come closer to him. It's only when such troubles come that they turn to God. He wants his people, Israel, to recognize him and turn to him and repent from their sins. Now that is why God is going to permit this. And what will happen next? How all these things will actually turn out, we will see in our next class, God willing. And until then, God be with you.